Hey guys, at first glance, Queen Victoria can seem like a ceremonial grandmother in black silk, a mournful figure surrounded by portraits and etiquette. But the quieter truth is stranger than that. By the late 19th century, her children and grandchildren had spread so widely across Europe's thrones that one family's private anxieties, marriages, illnesses, and ambitions could ripple outward into the politics of an entire continent. So before we settle in, let me know where you're watching from, and tell me which history topic you'd like me to explore next. And if you enjoy this kind of thoughtful long-form history, a like is a simple way to support it. And if calm, quietly fascinating history is your kind of evening listening, subscribe for more. To understand how Victoria came to seem almost woven into every royal household in Europe, it helps to begin not with power in the dramatic sense, but with something more intimate and more old-fashioned: family strategy, dynastic survival, and the peculiar reality that in 19th century Europe, marriage was never only marriage. When modern viewers imagine royal influence, they often picture decrees, armies, parliaments, and ceremonies. But monarchies were also living networks of kinship. A queen did not need to issue commands to shape events. Sometimes it was enough to advise a daughter, to approve a match, to disapprove of another, to write a careful letter at the right moment, or simply to exist at the center of an enormous web of relatives who all understood that blood ties could become diplomatic ties very quickly. Victoria's influence worked in precisely that quiet space between the domestic and the political, where nursery decisions could become continental consequences. She had not begun life as the obvious architect of Europe's royal future. Born in 1819, Alexandrina Victoria came into the world as a relatively minor princess in a crowded Hanoverian succession. There was nothing inevitable about her becoming one of the most symbolically powerful women in Europe. In fact, the accidents that elevated her were rooted in deaths, dynastic shortages, and the recurring fragility of royal lines. By the time she ascended the throne in 1837, at the age of just 18, Britain had acquired a young queen in an age that was still uneasy about female rule, and Europe had acquired a new figure to watch. In her early years, Victoria was not yet the commanding matriarch people often imagine. She was young, sometimes stubborn, intensely emotional, and still learning what monarchy would require of her. Yet even early on, she developed habits that mattered later. She took family life seriously. She attached deep importance to personal loyalty, and she believed, with increasing conviction, that private virtue and public stability belonged together. That belief would become one of the foundations of her dynastic thinking. She did not see royal marriage as a matter of romance alone, nor as cynical transaction alone, but as a structure in which character, morality, religion, duty, and politics were all knotted together. Her marriage to Prince Albert in 1840 gave that worldview both emotional force and practical shape. Albert was not merely her husband. He became her intellectual companion, advisor, and collaborator in building a model of respectable monarchy that was meant to contrast with the scandals and instability associated with earlier royal generations. Together they presented an image of domestic seriousness, a royal household centered on marriage, children, order, and moral discipline. That image was politically useful in Britain, where the crown had to coexist with parliamentary government and a skeptical public. But it also had a wider effect. Victoria and Albert came to see their growing family as something more than private happiness. It was, in time, a dynastic instrument. This is one of the first quiet ironies in the story. Victoria's power over Europe was not built through conquest, and not even chiefly through Britain's empire, immense though that empire was. It was built through births, baptisms, courtships, and wedding negotiations. It emerged out of drawing rooms as much as cabinet rooms. The great expansion of her familial reach took place not by annexing territory, but by placing sons, daughters, and grandchildren into a royal marriage market where the right union might stabilize an alliance, reinforce a dynasty, elevate prestige, or prevent a rival match. There were practical reasons for this. European royalty in the 19th century was both exclusive and surprisingly small. Suitable Protestant princes and princesses of acceptable rank, religion, reputation, and political usefulness did not exist in unlimited numbers. The same names and houses appeared again and again. Prussia, Denmark, Russia, Hesse, Saxe-Coburg, Greece, Romania, and others connected by old dynastic habits and newer national anxieties. A royal mother with many children and rising prestige possessed a kind of soft leverage simply because she had options. Victoria and Albert had 9 children. That alone made them unusually important in this marriage landscape. Yet numbers alone did not create the legend that she had somehow controlled Europe's royal families. What made Victoria exceptional was the combination of scale, personality, correspondence, and timing. She lived long enough to watch her children marry into multiple courts. She remained emotionally invested in their lives, often to a degree that could feel overwhelming. She wrote constantly. She had opinions on suitability, religion, behavior, dynastic duty, and rank. And because the 19th century still allowed monarchs and their relatives a substantial role in arranging or obstructing marriages, those opinions could matter very much indeed. Her letters became one of her principal instruments. Victoria belonged to a world in which letter writing was not an afterthought but a central technology of governance and intimacy. Through letters she advised, complained, warned, praised, pressed, and mourned. She could remind a daughter of her obligations, caution a son-in-law, express alarm about political developments, or urge moderation during a family dispute that was also, inevitably, a state matter. Sometimes her interventions worked because she was queen. Just as often they worked because she was mother, mother-in-law, or grandmother, and those roles carried emotional authority that formal office could not always command. Even so, it would be too simple to imagine her as a hidden puppeteer, moving kings and queens like pieces on a board. That is not how European monarchy actually functioned. Royal families argued, resisted, married against advice, developed loyalties to their adopted countries, and were constrained by ministers, constitutions, parliaments, public opinion, and national crises. Victoria's influence was real, but influence is not the same thing as control. In fact, part of what makes this history worth lingering over is that her apparent omnipresence often concealed how limited even a famous queen could be when confronted by distance, personality, and the hardening nationalism of modern Europe. Still, from the middle decades of the century onward, her family map began to look astonishing. Her eldest daughter, Vicky, married the future German Emperor Frederick III, tying the British crown directly to the Hohenzollern dynasty in Prussia. Her son, the future Edward VII, married Princess Alexandra of Denmark. Another daughter, Alice, married Louis of Hesse. Alfred married into the Russian imperial family. Helena, Louise, Arthur, Leopold, and Beatrice all became part of the wider dynastic story in different ways. Then came the grandchildren, and with them the real multiplication of ties. Through those descendants, Victoria's bloodline reached the German Empire, Russia, Romania, Greece, Norway, Spain, and beyond. For listeners today, one of the most revealing parts of this story is how little the family sphere and the political sphere were separated. A marriage negotiation might involve questions that sound deeply personal. Is the young man steady? Is the princess healthy? Are their temperaments compatible? Is the family respectable? But behind those questions stood others that were unmistakably political. Will this increase Prussian influence? Will it offend France? What confession will the children be raised in? Will the bride adapt to a constitutional monarchy or a more authoritarian court? Can this match preserve peace within a tense alliance system, or might it draw one court too close to another? Victoria understood these layers, even if she did not always interpret them correctly. She had strong instincts, but they were not infallible. She could be shrewd about character and blind about national feeling. She often assumed that shared family values, especially those she prized: duty, moral seriousness, Protestant respectability, domestic discipline, could moderate political friction. That assumption was not foolish, exactly. In a world of hereditary courts, personal relationships did matter. But it underestimated how quickly Europe was changing. National rivalries, militarism, constitutional struggles, imperial competition, and public politics were all becoming more powerful than family sentiment. A grandson might still love his grandmother and yet preside over a government whose interests ran sharply against those of his cousins. That tension gives the whole subject its melancholy undercurrent. Victoria's dynastic web looked, on the surface, like a triumph of familial connectivity. It suggested a Europe whose ruling houses had become so intertwined that mutual understanding might deepen almost naturally. After all, if emperors, kings, and queens were cousins writing to one another, visiting one another, and mourning one another's dead, perhaps that intimacy might soften the rough edges of power. But family closeness did not erase ambition, fear, or strategic calculation. In some cases, it may even have made rivalries more emotionally charged. There was another complication, quieter but no less significant. Victoria's idea of a proper royal family was deeply shaped by her own tastes and prejudices. She admired Albert's seriousness and German princely culture. She valued order, piety, and obedience. She could be critical, sometimes sharply so, when children disappointed her expectations. She preferred some matches over others, distrusted certain courts, and had strong views on who would elevate or diminish the family's moral standing. In that sense, her influence over Europe's royal houses was not simply about spreading British prestige. It was also about exporting a particular domestic model, one rooted in her own sense of discipline, propriety, and dynastic duty. And yet, the more her family spread, the less manageable it became. This is the deeper paradox at the center of the story. Expansion brought reach, but it also brought dilution. The more thrones touched Victoria's family tree, the more competing loyalties entered it. A daughter who became crown princess in Prussia could not remain simply Victoria's daughter. She became part of another political world, with its own pressures, enemies, expectations, and resentments. A granddaughter who married into Russia might still write affectionate letters home, but she would be absorbed into an imperial court governed by traditions and anxieties that Victoria could not master from Windsor or Osborne. So when people say that Queen Victoria secretly controlled every royal family in Europe, they are touching something real, but only partly. She stood at the center of a remarkable dynastic network. She exercised real influence through marriage, motherhood, correspondence, prestige, and longevity. She could encourage, obstruct, advise, and worry on a continental scale. But what made her so important was not magical control. It was that 19th century Europe still allowed family to function as a form of politics. And Victoria happened to become the most connected family figure of them all. To see how that influence worked in practice, though we have to move from the broad map to the individual marriages themselves, because it was in those marriages that Victoria's hopes became visible, and also where the limits of her design first began to show. To see how that influence worked in practice, though we have to move from the broad map to the individual marriages themselves, because it was in those marriages that Victoria's hopes became visible, and also where the limits of her design first began to show. The first and perhaps most revealing case was the marriage of her eldest child, Victoria, known within the family as Vicky. This union mattered far beyond the private happiness of a princess. In marrying Vicky to Prince Frederick William of Prussia, the future Frederick III, Victoria, and Albert were not merely arranging a respectable dynastic match. They were attaching their family directly to one of the most consequential states in Europe. Prussia was not yet the German Empire, but it was already the most formidable of the German-speaking powers, disciplined, militarily prestigious, and increasingly central to the question of how Germany might one day be organized. For Albert especially, this match carried an almost idealistic promise. He was German by birth, British by adoption, and deeply interested in the possibility that a reformed, enlightened Prussia might become a stabilizing force in Europe. He believed constitutionalism, education, administrative seriousness, and moral responsibility could coexist with monarchy. If Vicky and Frederick could embody those values at the Prussian court, perhaps they might help shape the future of Germany in a more liberal and moderate direction. It was an ambitious hope, and in some ways a very characteristic one. Victoria and Albert often believed that personal character, properly placed, might improve entire institutions. That belief was not entirely unreasonable. Royal households were still political environments. A crown princess was not simply decorative. She influenced culture at court, raised future heirs, formed relationships with ministers and relatives, and could serve as a conduit for ideas. Vicky herself was intelligent, highly educated, energetic, and politically aware. She was not being sent abroad as passive ornament. Her parents expected her to be serious, useful, and in some sense transformative. The marriage, solemnized in 1858, seemed at first to justify their confidence. Frederick was thoughtful, comparatively liberal in outlook, and personally attached to Vicky. On paper, the union looked almost perfect. But here, very early, one of the central ironies of Victoria's dynastic world begins to emerge. A marriage could look ideal when judged by family values, and still become entangled in a political culture far harsher than the one imagined at Windsor. Vicky did not enter a court waiting gratefully to be improved by British constitutional habits. She entered a Prussian environment shaped by military prestige, conservative traditions, dynastic pride, and suspicion of outside influence. The very qualities her parents prized in her, her intelligence, frankness, confidence, and liberal sympathies, could make her controversial there. She was not merely a princess. She was, in the eyes of some, an English princess, and England represented a model of monarchy many Prussian conservatives did not trust. This distinction mattered deeply. Victoria often thought in familial and moral terms, but the courts her children entered were also national courts. Foreignness could not simply be dissolved by wedding ceremony. Vicky's British upbringing, her affection for her parents, and her liberal instincts all carried political meaning in Berlin. When she expressed opinions, those opinions were not received as neutral. They could be heard as English opinions, or as unwelcome constitutional opinions, or as evidence that the future crown princess did not fully respect Prussian ways. A daughter's marriage, in other words, did not merely extend Victoria's reach. It also exposed her child to the resentments that came with being an extension of that reach. And yet Victoria remained emotionally and intellectually involved. She wrote to Vicky often, sometimes tenderly, sometimes anxiously, sometimes with unmistakable force. The correspondence between mother and daughter became one of the invisible channels through which family, politics, and personal pressure all flowed together. Victoria wanted reports. She wanted reassurance. She wanted her daughter to stand firm in principle, but also to maintain dignity, influence, and family reputation. Such advice could be useful, but it could also be burdensome. There is something quietly exhausting in the royal family system at this point. Private feeling was rarely allowed to remain private. Almost every disappointment could acquire dynastic weight. The Prussian marriage also demonstrates something else that modern viewers often underestimate. Victoria was not always seeking domination in a crude sense. More often, she was trying to secure an environment she regarded as safe, moral, and stable for her children and grandchildren. She wanted them properly married, properly situated, properly guided. Control, in her world, often appeared as concern. But concern repeated often enough from a mother who was also queen could feel very much like pressure. This was especially true because Victoria's emotional intensity did not lessen as her family grew. If anything, widowhood after Albert's death in 1861 deepened it. Albert's death altered the whole structure of the dynasty. It left Victoria grief-stricken, more withdrawn in some respects, but also more possessive of memory, family duty, and Albert's political ideals. The marriages of the children increasingly became, in her mind, part of preserving his legacy. She had lost the partner with whom she had imagined and managed much of this dynastic project. What remained were the children, the grandchildren to come, and the sense that the family must continue to reflect the seriousness and morality Albert had represented. This gave her interventions an additional emotional charge. Advice now carried mourning within it. Disapproval could come wrapped in a sense of betrayal, not only of Victoria, but of the family model she and Albert had built together. Her son Bertie, the future Edward VII, presented a different kind of challenge. His marriage to Princess Alexandra of Denmark in 1863 became one of the most socially celebrated royal unions of the age. Alexandra was admired for her beauty, grace, and popularity. The match pleased the public and added another significant continental connection. But from Victoria's perspective, Bertie was never as satisfying a dynastic instrument as Vicky had seemed. He was sociable where she prized seriousness, worldly where she preferred discipline, and not obviously inclined to embody the high moral tone she had wanted for the monarchy. His marriage did not resolve that tension. If anything, it revealed the limits of maternal shaping within a family that was becoming too large, too adult, and too dispersed to fit a single model. Still, Alexandra's entrance into the family had wider implications. She was Danish, and Denmark's political position in relation to the German states would soon matter intensely. The Schleswig-Holstein crisis, and the wars connected to it, sharpened tensions between Danish and German interests. This meant that the British royal family now contained close personal ties to both sides of disputes that were not abstract. Vicky was in Prussia. Alexandra came from Denmark. Family sympathies and political loyalties did not align neatly. Victoria wanted unity, but Europe was becoming precisely the kind of place where unity inside a family might coexist with bitterness between states. This is one of the reasons her network fascinates historians. It was a map of affection laid over a map of rivalry. Another daughter, Alice, illustrates the story on a more intimate scale. Alice married Louis of Hesse in 1862, entering a smaller German court than Prussia's, but one no less important in the development of Victoria's wider dynastic influence. Alice was thoughtful, compassionate, and serious, with a practical intelligence that often recalled Albert more than some of her siblings did. Victoria valued her deeply, although their relationship, like so many in the family, was threaded with expectations and strain. Through Alice, the British royal line became linked to the House of Hesse, and through Hesse would later connect still more dramatically to Russia. Yet the Hesse marriage also showed the emotional costs of this system. Smaller courts lacked the grandeur of the largest monarchies, but they were not free of pressure. There were questions of money, status, household management, children, public responsibility, and illness. For royal women especially, marriage could mean not a romantic elevation but a transfer into duty under observation. Alice carried enormous domestic burdens, and Victoria, from afar, remained both supportive and demanding. The letters continued. Advice continued. The expectation that daughters should not merely live their roles but justify the dynastic wisdom behind them also continued. By this stage, a pattern becomes clear. Victoria's influence spread not because every marriage produced political success, but because each marriage added another corridor through which information, sentiment, and pressure might travel. A mother in Windsor could hear of court tensions in Darmstadt, of factional hostility in Berlin, of household strains in Copenhagen's orbit, of childbirths, illnesses, tutors, temperaments, and political prospects. The family network became a kind of emotional intelligence system for monarchy. It was imperfect, biased, and often full of misunderstanding, but it gave Victoria access to Europe in a way few sovereigns possessed. There was, however, a darker thread woven through the same family web, heredity in the biological sense, not merely the dynastic one. Victoria's descendants did not only inherit titles and alliances. Through her line there also spread the gene associated with hemophilia, the blood clotting disorder that would later affect several royal houses with devastating symbolic and personal consequences. This fact, unknown in its mechanism at the time, adds another layer of irony to Victoria's place in Europe. The same family network that helped bind royal houses together also carried hidden vulnerability from court to court. Marriages that seemed politically advantageous could become medically tragic. Royal lineage, so often treated as a guarantee of stability, contained its own quiet instabilities. At the time, of course, people did not understand genetics in modern terms. They saw only that some boys bled dangerously, that minor injuries could become fatal, and that certain lines seemed shadowed by inexplicable fragility. Victoria herself could not know the full pattern she had set in motion. Yet later generations would remember this as part of her continental legacy. The family web did not merely link thrones. It transmitted risk. That fact alone should make the word control feel too neat. No one was controlling the deepest consequences of these marriages. They were making decisions within the limits of the knowledge available to them, and some of the consequences would only become legible later. As the children married and grandchildren began to arrive, Victoria's position shifted again. She was no longer just a queen arranging offspring. She was becoming the grandmother of an emerging royal continent. This role suited her in some ways and frustrated her in others. Grandmotherhood extended her emotional claim over multiple courts, but it also multiplied the number of personalities, languages, loyalties, and disputes she had to interpret. She adored many of the grandchildren and took a serious interest in their upbringing. She also judged them, compared them, worried over them, and placed hopes upon them that could be heavy to bear. What made this more than family drama was the timing. The second half of the 19th century was a period when monarchy was trying to survive in a Europe changing faster than hereditary systems were comfortable admitting. National unifications, industrialization, expanding literacy, stronger public opinion, a more active press, constitutional change, and recurring ideological conflict all made monarchy more exposed. Royal families responded in part by drawing more tightly around one another, using marriages to reinforce legitimacy and continuity. Victoria stood at the center of that strategy not simply because she was prolific in descendants, but because Britain itself offered prestige, stability, and imperial scale. To marry into her family was to connect with one of the most visible crowns in the world. That prestige gave Victoria leverage, but also illusions. Because Britain's monarchy had found a way to coexist with parliamentary politics while retaining enormous ceremonial and social authority, she and Albert often assumed similar balances might be possible elsewhere. Sometimes they were partly right, sometimes they were profoundly wrong. The Prussian case in particular would expose how difficult it was to transplant British constitutional assumptions into a political culture built on very different foundations. Vicky and Frederick could admire liberal principles, but admiration did not give them the power to reshape the structures around them. Courts had factions. Armies had traditions. Ministers had ambitions. Dynasties had long memories. Personal virtue could influence these things but not master them. This is why the Vicky-Frederick marriage remains so central to understanding Victoria's larger project. It was the marriage that most clearly embodied the hope that family connection could guide Europe toward moderation. And it was also the marriage that most painfully demonstrated how limited that hope could be. For years, Frederick remained heir rather than ruler, while Prussia changed rapidly under forces larger than the preferences of any crown princess. Otto von Bismarck rose. Wars reshaped the balance of Europe. German unification took place not as a liberal constitutional dream but through blood, diplomacy, coercion, and Prussian military success. By the time the German Empire was proclaimed in 1871, the world Victoria had hoped her daughter might gently influence had hardened into something more powerful, more national, and less pliable. Yet even here, the family angle never disappeared. Bismarck might dominate German politics, but Victoria still had a daughter at the center of the Prussian and then imperial household. She still received reports. She still interpreted events through family feeling. She could still imagine that future changes might come through Frederick's eventual accession, through Vicky's influence, through the education of grandchildren, through time itself. This tendency to keep hope alive through the family, even when public developments were moving in another direction, is one of the most human things about her. It was not only political misjudgment. It was a mother's refusal to believe that the great effort of marriage, upbringing, and sacrifice might lead somewhere she had never wanted her children to go. By the 1870s, then, Victoria's continental role was unmistakable. She had children in major dynastic houses, grandchildren multiplying through Europe, a reputation that made her family politically desirable, and a habit of correspondence that kept her involved almost everywhere. But the quality of that involvement was changing. It was becoming less like design and more like constant management of unintended consequences. One child's marriage created another diplomatic awkwardness. One court's hostility provoked maternal outrage. One illness reopened old fears. One promising heir turned disappointing. One beloved grandchild became the focus of new dynastic hopes. And among those grandchildren, a new generation was already growing up that would make Victoria's network seem even more extraordinary and even more unstable than it had looked through her children alone. Because once those grandchildren began marrying into Europe's reigning and future houses, the web thickened beyond even what Victoria and Albert had first imagined. The family was no longer simply connected to Europe. In some cases, it was becoming Europe's royal bloodstream, carrying affection, expectation, rivalry, and vulnerability in equal measure. And among those grandchildren, a new generation was already growing up that would make Victoria's network seem even more extraordinary and even more unstable than it had looked through her children alone. What changed with this generation was not simply scale, but distance, emotional, cultural, and political. Victoria could guide her children with a certain confidence, even when they resisted her. But grandchildren were shaped as much by their own courts, tutors, and national expectations as by any advice arriving from Britain. They spoke different languages from infancy, absorbed different political assumptions, and learned to identify not only as members of a family, but as representatives of states that were becoming more self-conscious and, in some cases, more defensive. This is where the quiet transformation of Europe begins to press more visibly against Victoria's dynastic design. In earlier decades, royal marriages could plausibly serve as bridges between courts. By the late 19th century, those bridges were still built, but they increasingly spanned political landscapes that were hardening beneath them. National identity was no longer a soft concept. It was becoming something sharper, more emotionally charged, and more difficult to reconcile with the older idea that Europe's monarchs formed, in some sense, a single extended household. Victoria did not ignore this change, but she often interpreted it through a familial lens. When tensions arose between states connected by her descendants, she instinctively looked for personal explanations. She asked whether a son-in-law had been badly advised, whether a granddaughter was being treated properly, whether misunderstandings might be resolved through clearer communication or firmer moral example. In some cases, These instincts allowed her to ease minor frictions. In others, they led her to underestimate how little room remained for personal intervention once political interests had begun to diverge. One of the most illustrative examples of this shift can be found in the figure of her grandson, Wilhelm. As the son of Vicky and Frederick, he stood precisely at the intersection of Victoria's hopes and Europe's changing realities. From Victoria's perspective, he was not merely a future German ruler. He was family, a boy whose upbringing could, in theory, shape the direction of a great power. She watched his development closely, often with concern. Reports from Berlin did not always reassure her. Wilhelm could be restless, ambitious, eager for recognition, and at times resistant to the influence of his parents, particularly his mother, whose English background and liberal inclinations made her a complicated figure in the Prussian court. Victoria's correspondence reflects a growing unease. She had once believed that the careful education of royal children might gradually produce a generation of rulers more aligned with the values she and Albert had cherished. But in Wilhelm, she began to see something less predictable. He was not a simple extension of her daughter's outlook. He was forming his own identity within a system that rewarded assertiveness, military pride, and a distinctly German imperial vision. The very environment into which Vicky had married was now shaping her son in ways Victoria could not easily influence. There is a subtle but important emotional shift here. Earlier in her life, Victoria often wrote with the confidence of someone helping to construct a dynastic future. By the time her grandchildren were coming of age, her tone could become more defensive, more anxious, sometimes even slightly bewildered. The system she had helped to build was still functioning in form. Marriages were still being arranged, alliances still reinforced, but the outcomes were no longer aligning as clearly with her expectations. Influence had become observation, and observation sometimes brought discomfort. At the same time, the geographic spread of her descendants continued to widen. Through another line of grandchildren, the British royal family became linked more directly with Russia. This connection, which would later be symbolized most poignantly through the marriage of Alex of Hesse, Victoria's granddaughter, to Tsar Nicholas II, illustrates how deeply her family had penetrated the highest levels of European monarchy. The Russian court, with its immense scale, rigid traditions, and autocratic structure, was very different from the constitutional environment of Britain. Yet through marriage, it too became part of Victoria's extended family world. From a distance, this could appear as the culmination of her dynastic reach. A granddaughter as Empress of Russia, others connected to German principalities, still others linked to Scandinavia and the Balkans. On paper, it looked like an extraordinary consolidation of familial presence across Europe. But if one listens carefully to the tone of Victoria's later letters, there is often a sense that proximity did not guarantee harmony. She could be affectionate but also critical. She could offer advice, but also express frustration when it was not followed. And perhaps most tellingly, she could not always reconcile the differences between the worlds her descendants now inhabited. Russia, in particular, represented a kind of limit case. The expectations placed upon a Russian empress were shaped by autocracy, orthodoxy, and court ritual that had little in common with Victoria's own experience of monarchy. A granddaughter raised within a German and British-influenced environment had to adapt to a system that was less flexible, less transparent, and in many ways more isolated from the political currents shaping Western Europe. Victoria could advise from afar, but she could not easily translate her model of monarchy into that context. The family connection remained real, but the gap between systems was becoming harder to bridge. At the same time, the Danish connection through Alexandra continued to produce its own quiet tensions. Denmark's historical conflicts with the German states, particularly over Schleswig and Holstein, did not simply fade because members of the same extended family occupied positions on both sides. Instead, those conflicts became layered with personal feeling. Alexandra retained strong sympathies for her native Denmark, while Vicky and her family were embedded within a German political framework that had very different priorities. Victoria, watching from Britain, found herself emotionally tied to both perspectives, yet unable to reconcile them fully. These overlapping loyalties created a kind of emotional geography that ran alongside the political map of Europe. Letters between relatives carried not only affection, but also disagreement, sometimes carefully phrased, sometimes more direct. Visits between courts could be warm on the surface, yet shadowed by awareness of deeper divisions. The family gatherings that once symbolized unity began, in subtle ways, to reveal the strain of representing states whose interests were no longer easily aligned. And still, the marriages continued. Part of this persistence came from necessity. Royal families could not simply abandon the system that sustained them. Marriage remained one of the primary ways to maintain status, legitimacy, and continuity. Even as nationalism rose, the pool of suitable partners remained relatively narrow. Victoria's descendants, by now numerous and prestigious, were still highly sought after. A marriage into her line carried symbolic weight. It suggested connection to stability, to longevity, to one of the most recognized monarchies in the world. But there was also a deeper habit at work. The idea that family could serve as a stabilizing force in Europe had not entirely lost its appeal. Even as evidence accumulated that personal ties could not override political conflict, the instinct to reinforce those ties remained strong. It was almost as if the system could not imagine an alternative. To stop intermarrying would be to admit that the older vision of dynastic Europe had fundamentally changed. And that was not a conclusion easily accepted by those who had built their identities within that vision. Victoria herself, advancing in age, became more symbolic in her role. She was no longer attempting to shape every outcome directly. Instead, she represented continuity, a living link across decades of European history. Her longevity meant that multiple generations of rulers could claim her as grandmother or great-grandmother. This gave her a kind of quiet authority, even when her practical influence was limited. To be connected to her was to be part of a story that extended beyond any single reign or crisis. Yet symbolism can sometimes obscure reality. The image of Victoria as the grandmother of Europe suggested unity, but the reality beneath it was increasingly complex. Her descendants occupied courts that were moving along different trajectories. Some were becoming more constitutional, others more rigidly autocratic. Some were adapting to public opinion, others resisting it. Some were drawn into alliances that would later define the geopolitical structure of the early 20th century. The family network connected them, but it did not necessarily align them. If anything, the network sometimes made differences more visible. When cousins met, they did not only recognize their shared ancestry. They also saw how differently they had been shaped. One might embody military discipline and imperial ambition, another domestic restraint and constitutional caution. One might be surrounded by a court culture of ceremony and distance, another by a more restrained and publicly accountable monarchy. These contrasts did not always produce conflict, but they did make it clear that a single family could no longer be expected to carry a single political outlook. There is a moment, often overlooked, when this realization begins to settle more firmly into the consciousness of those involved. It does not arrive as a dramatic declaration. Instead, it appears in small observations. A letter noting that a relative has adopted a tone that feels unfamiliar. A visit where conversation turns awkward when politics are mentioned. A sense that advice, once welcomed, is now politely ignored. These are the signs of a system adjusting to limits it had not previously encountered. Victoria continued to write, to advise, to worry, and to hope. But by the closing decades of the 19th century, the balance had shifted. Her family still spanned Europe. Her presence was still felt in multiple courts. Yet the idea that she could meaningfully guide the direction of those courts had become less certain. The web remained, but its threads were being pulled in different directions. And as those threads stretched further, the next series of marriages among her grandchildren would bind together not just individual courts, but the emerging alliances that would define Europe's political landscape in the years leading toward a far more unstable future. And as those threads stretched further, the next series of marriages among her grandchildren would bind together not just individual courts, but the emerging alliances that would define Europe's political landscape in the years leading toward a far more unstable future. At this stage, something subtle but decisive was happening beneath the surface of these unions. Earlier marriages in Victoria's family had often been guided by a mixture of personal compatibility and dynastic usefulness, shaped by a belief that carefully placed individuals might gently influence entire systems. But as her grandchildren came of age, the environment surrounding them had grown more structured, more strategic, and less open to quiet redirection. Marriage was still personal, but it was increasingly conducted in the shadow of larger alignments that no single family, however extensive, could fully manage. One can begin to see this in the marriage of Princess Alix of Hesse, Victoria's granddaughter, to Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. On its surface, the union retained all the familiar elements of the earlier dynastic pattern. Alix was of impeccable royal lineage, closely connected to Victoria's line through her mother, Alice. Nicholas was the heir, and then the ruler of one of Europe's most powerful empires. The match brought together two of the continent's most prominent royal houses, and it did so through a relationship that, at least initially, contained genuine affection. Victoria herself had watched this courtship with a mixture of concern and cautious acceptance. She worried about Alix's ability to adapt to Russia, about the pressures of the Russian court, and about the emotional intensity of a granddaughter who had already endured personal loss. Yet she also understood the broader significance of the match. A British-descended princess as Empress of Russia would, in theory, strengthen ties between two major powers, or at the very least deepen channels of communication between their ruling families. But here again, the familiar tension reappears. The marriage did not unfold in a vacuum. Russia at the end of the 19th century was not simply another royal court into which a granddaughter might comfortably settle. It was an empire facing profound internal strain, governed by a system that was resistant to reform, and increasingly out of step with the political currents moving through Western Europe. Nicholas himself, though personally gentle in some respects, was committed to maintaining autocratic authority. The expectations placed upon Alix were immense, and they were shaped by a court culture that was formal, insular, and often suspicious of outside influence. Victoria's capacity to shape this situation was limited from the beginning. She could advise, encourage, and worry, but she could not transform the Russian system into something more familiar. Nor could she shield her granddaughter from the pressures that came with becoming empress. The letters that passed between them reveal a relationship that was affectionate but also marked by distance, not only geographic but experiential. Victoria's understanding of monarchy, grounded in British constitutional practice and her own domestic model, could not easily map onto the realities of St. Petersburg. At the same time, another branch of her descendants was reinforcing connections within Germany itself, where the newly unified empire was beginning to assert its place on the European stage with increasing confidence. The German Empire, formed under Prussian leadership, did not reflect the liberal aspirations Victoria and Albert had once associated with Vicky's marriage. Instead, it had emerged through a combination of military success, political calculation, and a strong sense of national identity. Within this system, the next generation of Victoria's descendants would operate not as agents of reform, but as participants in a state whose priorities were already firmly established. Wilhelm, now moving steadily toward power, embodied this shift in particularly clear terms. As he matured, his personality became more defined. Ambitious, energetic, often unpredictable, and deeply conscious of Germany's place in the world. His relationship with his mother remained strained, shaped in part by her background and her perceived distance from the dominant currents of German political life. For Victoria, observing from Britain, this was a source of ongoing unease. She had once imagined that the Prussian connection might gently steer Germany in a direction compatible with her own values. Now, it appeared increasingly likely that Germany would follow its own course, one that did not require guidance from outside. What makes this period especially revealing is that Victoria continued to engage with these developments in the same medium she had always relied upon: the letter. She wrote to her children and grandchildren with remarkable frequency, commenting on their choices, offering encouragement, expressing concern, and sometimes attempting to influence their decisions. But the effect of these letters was changing. In earlier years, they had been part of a collaborative process, a shared effort to shape a family and, through it, a network of influence. By the 1880s and 1890s, they could feel more like attempts to maintain coherence within a system that was gradually moving beyond her reach. There is something almost architectural in the way this transformation unfolds. Victoria had helped construct a vast dynastic structure, carefully placing its foundations through marriage and upbringing. For a time, the structure appeared stable, even elegant. But as external pressures increased, nationalism, shifting alliances, internal political tensions, the structure began to bear stresses it had not been designed to absorb. The connections remained, but they did not distribute pressure evenly. Instead, they sometimes transmitted it, carrying the weight of one conflict into the emotional and personal spaces of another. This can be seen in the way disputes between states began to echo within the family itself. A disagreement between governments might find its reflection in a strained exchange between relatives. A diplomatic crisis could alter the tone of correspondence, introduce caution into conversation, or even limit visits that had once been routine. The family network, once imagined as a stabilizing force, was becoming a kind of mirror, reflecting the fractures of Europe rather than smoothing them over. And yet, it would be misleading to suggest that Victoria's influence had vanished entirely. Even in this more constrained environment, her position carried weight. She was still the longest reigning monarch of her time, a figure of immense symbolic importance. Her approval or disapproval could matter, particularly in matters of marriage. Her opinions on character, conduct, and propriety still shaped how her descendants were perceived within the broader royal community. And perhaps most importantly, her very existence as a central figure in this network continued to provide a point of reference, a reminder of continuity in a period that was otherwise marked by change. This symbolic role became especially apparent during major family gatherings, where representatives of multiple European courts would come together under a shared identity, if only briefly. These occasions, often marked by ceremony and careful protocol, offered a glimpse of the older vision of dynastic unity. Relatives greeted one another, exchanged news, and performed the rituals of kinship that had long underpinned their connections. For a moment, the idea of a European royal family seemed tangible, even persuasive. But beneath the surface, the differences remained. Conversations could not entirely escape the political realities each participant represented. A German prince, a Russian Grand Duchess, a British royal, each carried not only personal identity but national significance. The very act of gathering revealed how much had changed. Where once such meetings might have reinforced a sense of shared purpose, they now often highlighted divergence. The family was still there, but it no longer spoke with a single voice. As Victoria entered the final phase of her life, this duality became more pronounced. She was at once the center of an extraordinary network and a witness to its limitations. Her descendants occupied thrones across Europe, yet those thrones were increasingly defined by forces beyond her influence. The system she had helped to build was still visible, still active, but no longer fully aligned with the assumptions that had guided its creation. And still, the marriages continued to shape the map. In Scandinavia, in the Balkans, in the great empires of the East and the established monarchies of the West, Victoria's descendants formed connections that seemed, at a glance, to promise a kind of cohesion. But as the century approached its end, those connections were beginning to intersect with a new set of alignments. Alliances that were formalized not through family, but through treaties, military planning, and shared strategic concerns. These alliances did not replace the dynastic network, but they overlaid it, creating a more complex and, in some ways, more fragile structure. A king might be a cousin to another monarch, yet bound by treaty to oppose him in a crisis. A queen might maintain affectionate correspondence with a relative whose government pursued policies at odds with her own. The lines of loyalty were no longer singular. They crossed, overlapped, and sometimes contradicted one another. Victoria could see parts of this transformation, though not all of its implications. She understood that Europe was changing. She recognized that her family, however extensive, could not simply impose harmony upon a continent moving in different directions. Yet she also continued to believe, in a quiet and persistent way, that personal relationships still mattered, that they might yet soften tensions, that familiarity might restrain hostility, that shared history might provide a kind of buffer against the worst outcomes. It was a belief rooted in experience, but one that would soon be tested more severely than anything her generation had yet faced. Because as her grandchildren settled into their roles, and as the alliances around them hardened into more defined blocks, the question was no longer simply how far her influence extended, but whether that influence could endure at all under the pressure of a Europe preparing, almost unknowingly, for a far more decisive confrontation. And in the years just before that pressure would begin to show itself more openly, the relationships between her most prominent grandsons, men who had once played together as children within this vast family network, were already beginning to take on a new and more consequential significance. What makes this moment particularly striking is how ordinary those relationships had once seemed. As children, they had visited one another's courts, attended family gatherings, shared tutors or influences, and absorbed a sense, however faint, that they belonged to something larger than their individual nations. There are glimpses in letters and recollections of an almost gentle familiarity. They addressed one another by nicknames, wrote with casual warmth, and moved within a social world that blurred the boundaries between kingdoms. But as they matured, the context surrounding them changed far more quickly than the language of their relationships. The same individuals who had once met as cousins were now becoming emperors, kings, and rulers in systems that demanded not personal warmth, but political clarity. And in that transition, something subtle began to harden. The familiarity remained, but it no longer defined the relationship. It existed alongside expectations of power, responsibility, and national interest that could not easily be set aside. For Victoria, observing this transformation from the later years of her reign, the shift must have felt both gradual and unsettling. She had always believed that family ties could serve as a kind of quiet restraint, that rulers who knew one another personally might hesitate before allowing tensions to escalate too far. It was not an entirely naive belief. In earlier generations, dynastic relationships had sometimes played exactly that role. But by the end of the 19th century, the scale and complexity of European politics had expanded beyond the reach of such informal moderation. One can see this clearly in the evolving relationship between her grandsons who stood at the head of major powers. Their correspondence, when it occurred, often retained the tone of family familiarity. Yet beneath that tone, there was a growing awareness that each represented a different set of interests, pressures, and expectations. A letter might express affection, but it could not alter the realities of military planning, alliance commitments, or domestic political demands. This creates one of the most quietly revealing contradictions in the entire story. The closer the family connections became, the more visible the differences between the systems they represented. A British monarch, operating within a constitutional framework, faced constraints that were fundamentally different from those of a Russian autocrat or a German emperor shaped by a newly unified state. Even when they spoke the language of kinship, they were not acting within the same political vocabulary. Victoria's own position in this changing environment was complex. She remained a figure of immense respect, and her opinions continued to carry weight within the family. But the nature of that weight had shifted. Earlier, she could shape marriages, guide upbringing, and influence the direction of relationships as they formed. Now, she was more often reacting to developments rather than directing them. Her letters reflect this adjustment. There is still advice, still concern, still a desire to shape outcomes, but also an increasing recognition that events were unfolding in ways that could not be easily redirected. At the same time, the public image of her as the grandmother of Europe continued to grow stronger. It was an image that simplified a far more complicated reality. To the outside observer, it suggested a kind of unity, a web of relationships that might hold the continent together. But within that web, the tensions were becoming more pronounced. The very density of the connections made it harder to ignore how differently each branch of the family was evolving. There is a particularly telling dynamic in the way communication itself began to change. While Victoria's generation had relied heavily on letters, the next generation lived in a world where communication was becoming faster, more immediate, and, in some ways, more constrained by official channels. The telegraph, for example, allowed for quicker exchanges, but it also introduced a different tone. More formal, more cautious, less reflective. The slow, detailed letters that had once carried nuance and emotion were gradually supplemented, and sometimes replaced, by messages that were shorter and more deliberate. This shift mattered because it altered how influence could be exercised. A carefully written letter, composed over time, allowed for persuasion, explanation, and emotional connection. A telegram did not. It conveyed information, sometimes urgency, but rarely depth. As communication changed, so too did the space in which Victoria's traditional methods of influence could operate. The medium itself became less accommodating to the kind of sustained, personal intervention she had once relied upon. Meanwhile, the alliances forming across Europe were becoming more structured and less dependent on personal relationships. Agreements between states were increasingly formalized, tied to military planning and strategic calculations that extended beyond the preferences of individual rulers. These alliances created obligations that could override family considerations. A monarch might feel personal affection for a cousin in another court, yet still be bound by treaty to support a position that worked against that cousin's interests. This layering of obligation over relationship is one of the quiet turning points in the story. It does not appear suddenly. Instead, it builds gradually as more agreements are signed, as more expectations are defined, as more resources are committed to maintaining particular alignments. By the time it becomes fully visible, it is already deeply embedded. And at that point, the ability of any single individual, even one as centrally positioned as Victoria, to alter its course is significantly reduced. Yet even as these larger forces took shape, the family dimension did not disappear. It continued to operate alongside the formal structures, sometimes reinforcing them, sometimes complicating them. A marriage might align two courts more closely, but it might also introduce new sensitivities. A disagreement between governments could be softened by personal understanding, or it could be sharpened by a sense of betrayal. The interplay between family and politics remained active, but it was no longer predictable. Victoria's own responses to this complexity were often rooted in her enduring belief in the value of personal conduct. She emphasized duty, moderation, and the responsibilities of rank. She encouraged her descendants to act with restraint, to consider the broader consequences of their decisions, and to maintain a sense of moral seriousness. These were not empty ideals. They reflected a lifetime of experience in balancing personal and public roles. But as the environment around her changed, the effectiveness of these principles as tools of influence became less certain. There is also a quieter emotional dimension to her later years that is worth noticing. As her family expanded and dispersed, the sense of centrality she had once enjoyed became more symbolic than practical. She was still the point of reference, still the figure to whom others related, but she was no longer at the center of decision-making in the same way. The family had grown too large, too complex, and too embedded in different national contexts for that to remain possible. And yet, even in this more limited role, her presence continued to matter. It provided continuity in a period of change. It offered a shared history that could still be invoked, even when agreement was difficult. It reminded her descendants that, whatever their differences, they were part of a larger narrative that extended beyond their individual reigns. As the 19th century drew closer to its end, this narrative reached a point of quiet tension. The network Victoria had helped to build was fully formed, stretching across the continent in a pattern that was both impressive and fragile. The marriages had been made, the connections established, the lines of communication opened. But the world into which this network extended was no longer the same world in which it had been created. The next developments would not come from new marriages alone, but from the way existing relationships interacted with the pressures of a changing Europe. The grandsons who had once shared a sense of familial closeness were now positioned within systems that demanded clarity of allegiance. The alliances that had been forming were beginning to solidify into expectations that could not easily be ignored. And as these dynamics continued to evolve, the question that had once seemed almost secondary, whether family could truly influence the course of European politics, was slowly becoming central, not as a matter of theory, but as a reality that would soon be tested in ways Victoria herself could sense, even if she could not yet fully see where it would lead. What is particularly striking, as we move into the final years of her life, is how often that question appeared not in grand public statements, but in the quieter spaces where Victoria still felt most at home: private correspondence, small decisions about visits, and the careful reading of reports from her children and grandchildren. The scale of Europe's transformation was immense, but her vantage point remained deeply personal. She interpreted shifting alliances through tone, through the language used in letters, through whether invitations were accepted or declined, through the subtle changes in how relatives addressed one another. This method of reading the world had served her well for decades. It allowed her to sense tensions before they became visible in formal diplomacy. But by the end of the 19th century, it was also beginning to mislead her in small but meaningful ways. Because the forces shaping Europe were no longer confined to courts. They were increasingly driven by governments, military institutions, industrial capacity, and public sentiment, forces that did not always reveal themselves through family channels. Still, Victoria continued to believe that personal relationships could act as a kind of stabilizing layer over these deeper movements. If not to prevent conflict entirely, then at least to moderate it. And in fairness, there were moments when this belief seemed justified. Disagreements between courts did not always escalate. Tensions could be managed. A letter, a visit, or a shared memory could still create space for hesitation where there might otherwise have been none. But there were also signs, quiet at first but unmistakable, that hesitation was becoming harder to sustain. One of the most revealing developments was the gradual formalization of alliance systems that operated independently of dynastic ties. These alliances were not built through marriage, but through negotiation, planning, and mutual strategic interest. They involved detailed commitments, military coordination, contingency planning, and shared assumptions about potential conflicts. Once established, they created expectations that were not easily altered by personal preference. For Victoria, this represented a different kind of political reality. In her earlier years, alliances had often been fluid, influenced by personalities and circumstances. Now, they were becoming more rigid, more institutionalized. A ruler might wish to maintain a cordial relationship with a relative in another country, but find that his government's obligations pointed in a different direction. This shift did not happen all at once. It unfolded gradually, almost imperceptibly, as more agreements were signed and more resources committed to sustaining them. But by the 1890s, the outlines of a more structured European system were becoming visible. And within that system, the role of family, while still present, was no longer central. At the same time, the personalities of Victoria's grandchildren were coming into sharper focus. They were no longer children shaped primarily by their upbringing. They were rulers or soon-to-be rulers, navigating complex political environments. Their decisions were influenced by advisors, by national expectations, by the press, and by the need to maintain authority within their own systems. This meant that even when they maintained personal affection for one another, their actions could diverge significantly. A letter might express warmth, but a policy could still create tension. A visit might be cordial, but it could not erase underlying disagreements. The dual identity of these individuals, as both family members and heads of state, was becoming increasingly difficult to balance. Victoria observed this with a mixture of pride and unease. Pride, because her family had achieved a level of prominence that was almost unparalleled. Unease, because the very scale of that prominence made it harder to maintain the cohesion she had once imagined. There is a moment, often noted in accounts of her later years, when this unease becomes more clearly articulated. It appears not as a single declaration, but as a pattern in her correspondence. A growing emphasis on the importance of unity, on the dangers of division, on the need for her descendants to remember their shared origins. These themes had always been present, but they became more pronounced as the century drew to a close. It is tempting to read this as a kind of foresight, a recognition of the dangers that lay ahead. But it is perhaps more accurate to see it as a response to immediate experience. Victoria was reacting to what she could see. Differences in tone, disagreements in policy, signs that her grandchildren were not always aligned. She may not have anticipated the full scale of what was to come, but she could sense that the system she had helped to build was under strain. At the same time, her own position within that system was changing in another important way. As she aged, her direct involvement in daily governance diminished. She remained a figure of authority, but she relied increasingly on ministers and advisors to manage the practical aspects of rule. This created a subtle separation between her role as sovereign and her role as family matriarch. In some ways, the latter became more prominent, as it was the area where she could still exercise a form of influence that felt immediate and personal. Yet even here, the limits were becoming clearer. The sheer number of descendants, spread across multiple courts, made it impossible for her to maintain the same level of engagement with each of them. Decisions were made without her input. Situations developed that she could only observe from a distance. The network she had once actively managed was now operating with a degree of autonomy. And still, she continued to write. There is something almost rhythmic in the persistence of this habit. Letters sent across Europe, carrying advice, concern, affection, and occasionally frustration. They linked Windsor to Berlin, to St. Petersburg, to smaller courts scattered across the continent. They maintained a sense of connection, even as the political landscape grew more complex. But if one listens closely, the tone of these letters begins to shift in subtle ways. There is still confidence, but it is tempered by caution. There is still authority, but it is accompanied by a recognition that it may not always be heeded. There is still a belief in the value of family, but it is no longer presented as a solution to every problem. This evolution in tone mirrors the broader transformation taking place in Europe. The 19th century had begun with a strong belief in the power of dynastic connection to shape political outcomes. By its end, that belief had not disappeared, but it had been qualified. Family could influence, but it could not control. It could connect, but it could not necessarily unify. And yet, even as these limits became more apparent, the symbolic power of Victoria's position reached its height. She was now widely recognized not only as a long-reigning monarch, but as a central figure in the network of European royalty. Her jubilees were celebrated with a scale and enthusiasm that reflected both her personal longevity and the prestige of the British Empire. Representatives from across Europe and beyond participated in these events, reinforcing the image of a world in which she stood at the center. These occasions were carefully orchestrated, but they also carried genuine meaning. They brought together individuals who, despite their differences, shared a common heritage. They provided moments of visible unity in a period of increasing complexity. For a time, they seemed to confirm the idea that Victoria's family network could still function as a unifying force. But even within these celebrations, the underlying realities remained. The same individuals who gathered in London would return to their respective courts, where they faced pressures that could not be resolved through ceremony alone. The image of unity was powerful, but it was also, in some respects, fragile. As Victoria approached the end of her reign, the contrast between image and reality became more pronounced. On the surface, her influence appeared greater than ever. Beneath that surface, the forces shaping Europe were moving in directions that did not depend on her, and could not be easily redirected by her. And it is in this space, between the visible strength of her dynastic network and the growing independence of the systems it connected, that the next phase of the story begins to take shape, as her descendants move from inherited relationships into a world where those relationships would be tested in ways no previous generation had experienced. What becomes increasingly clear, as the century draws toward its close, is that Victoria's network had reached a kind of saturation point. There were now so many interconnections, so many marriages, so many shared bloodlines, that the original intention behind them had begun to blur. Where once a marriage might be carefully considered as a specific diplomatic bridge, now it often functioned as part of a much larger, more diffuse web. The system had grown so extensive that its coherence depended less on design and more on maintenance. And maintenance, in this context, meant something quieter and more continuous. It meant regular visits when possible, sustained correspondence, mutual recognition of rank and position, and above all, a shared understanding, however imperfect, that the relationships mattered. But as the demands of governance grew heavier for Victoria's grandchildren, these acts of maintenance became more difficult to sustain. Ruling a modernizing state required attention, presence, and energy. It meant engaging with ministers, responding to crises, managing public perception, and navigating increasingly complex political landscapes. Time spent in personal correspondence or extended visits could no longer be taken for granted. And as these practical pressures increased, the family network, which relied so heavily on personal engagement, began to loosen almost imperceptibly. There is a quiet shift here that is easy to miss. No single moment marks the change. There is no formal decision to step back from the system. Instead, it happens through accumulation. A delayed reply, a postponed visit, a shorter letter, a conversation that avoids certain topics. Each instance is small, understandable, even reasonable, but together they begin to alter the texture of the relationships. Victoria, sensitive to these nuances, noticed them. Her letters occasionally reflect a gentle insistence on maintaining contact, a reminder of obligations that were not written into treaties but were nonetheless expected within the family. She continued to believe that regular communication could preserve a sense of unity, and in some cases it did, but it could not entirely counterbalance the structural changes taking place around her. At the same time, the younger generation was developing its own understanding of what these relationships meant. For them, the network was not something they had built, it was something they had inherited. They did not necessarily share the same sense of purpose that had guided Victoria and Albert. To them, being cousins across Europe was a fact, but not always a strategy. Their primary responsibilities lay with their own states, and those responsibilities increasingly demanded clarity rather than flexibility. This difference in perspective is subtle but important. Victoria's generation had approached dynastic marriage with a sense of active construction, of shaping a future. The next generation approached it more as a condition of their existence, something to be managed rather than expanded. They maintained relationships where possible, but they did not always see those relationships as central to their political roles. And yet, even as this shift took place, the symbolic value of the network continued to exert its influence. Public ceremonies, state visits, and major family occasions still reinforced the image of a connected European royalty. These events were carefully observed, both by those within the system and by the broader public. They offered reassurance, a sense that continuity persisted despite change. But symbolism, as always, had its limits. It could create an impression of stability, but it could not resolve underlying tensions. And those tensions were becoming more pronounced as the century approached its end. One area where this becomes particularly visible is in the relationship between monarchy and public opinion. In earlier decades, royal decisions, especially those concerning marriage, could be made with relatively limited external scrutiny. By the late 19th century, this was no longer the case. The press had expanded, literacy had increased, and political awareness among the public had grown. Royal families were now observed, discussed, and sometimes criticized in ways that would have been unfamiliar to previous generations. This development added another layer of complexity to the network. Marriages were no longer judged solely within royal circles. They were also subject to public interpretation. A match that made sense dynastically might be questioned politically or socially. A royal figure might be admired in one country and viewed with suspicion in another. These perceptions could influence not only the success of a marriage, but also the broader relationship between courts. Victoria, who had spent much of her reign cultivating an image of respectability and moral seriousness, understood the importance of public perception. She had seen how the monarchy in Britain had benefited from presenting itself as stable, disciplined, and aligned with the values of its people. But extending that model across Europe was not straightforward. Each country had its own expectations, its own political culture, its own relationship with its monarchy. This meant that her descendants had to navigate not only the expectations of their family, but also those of their subjects. And sometimes those expectations were in tension. A decision that pleased one audience might unsettle another. A public gesture could carry different meanings in different contexts. The network, already complex, was now interacting with a broader and more unpredictable set of influences. At the same time, technological and industrial developments were changing the pace of life across Europe. Railways, telegraphs, and expanding urban centers were altering how people moved, communicated, and understood their place in the world. These changes did not directly dismantle the dynastic system, but they did reshape the environment in which it operated. For Victoria, whose early reign had unfolded in a slower, more measured context, this acceleration must have been both remarkable and disorienting. The world her grandchildren inhabited moved more quickly, responded more immediately, and demanded more constant attention. In such an environment, the slow, deliberate processes that had once underpinned dynastic influence, careful correspondence, Extended visits, gradual relationship building, became harder to sustain. And yet, despite all these changes, the fundamental structure of her network remained intact. The marriages had been made. The connections were real. The shared ancestry was undeniable. Even as the effectiveness of the system evolved, its presence continued to shape how European royalty understood itself. There is a kind of quiet persistence in this. The network did not collapse under pressure. It adapted, stretched, and in some cases weakened, but it remained a defining feature of the European royal landscape. It influenced decisions, informed perceptions, and provided a framework within which relationships could be understood, even when they could not be fully harmonized. As Victoria's reign moved into its final years, this persistence became one of its most notable characteristics. She had not created a perfectly unified Europe, nor had she established a system capable of preventing conflict. But she had created something else, a dense, intricate web of relationships that would continue to shape events long after her direct influence had faded. And it is at this point, with the network fully formed yet increasingly strained, that the focus begins to shift more decisively toward the individuals who would carry it forward. Her grandsons and granddaughters, now firmly established in their roles, facing a world in which the balance between family connection and political necessity was becoming ever more difficult to maintain. And it is at this point, with the network fully formed yet increasingly strained, that the focus begins to shift more decisively toward the individuals who would carry it forward. Her grandsons and granddaughters, now firmly established in their roles, facing a world in which the balance between family connection and political necessity was becoming ever more difficult to maintain. Among them, three figures begin to stand out with particular clarity, not because they intended to define the future of Europe together, but because history would later place them in that position. Victoria's grandsons who would come to represent Britain, Germany, and Russia. As boys, they had existed within the same extended familial orbit, their identities shaped partly by shared ancestry and occasional contact. But as men, they would occupy positions that required them to think not as cousins, but as rulers of distinct and increasingly self-conscious states. What makes this transition especially revealing is how gradual it appeared from within. There was no single moment when the identity of family gave way to the identity of nation. Instead, the two coexisted, overlapping and sometimes competing. A letter might still begin with a familial greeting, yet move quickly into matters of policy or concern shaped by national interest. A visit might retain its ceremonial warmth, yet carry an undercurrent of careful observation, each side aware of what the other represented beyond the personal. For Victoria, this duality had always existed in some form, but it was now becoming more pronounced. Her earlier confidence that shared upbringing and carefully arranged marriages might align perspectives was giving way to a more cautious awareness that upbringing alone could not determine how a ruler would act within his own system. Each grandson was shaped not only by family, but by the expectations of his court, the advice of his ministers, and the pressures of his political environment. In Britain, her line continued through her son and then grandson, within a constitutional framework that emphasized restraint, continuity, and public accountability. In Germany, the imperial structure that had emerged from unification fostered a different set of expectations, one that valued strength, visibility, and a more assertive expression of national identity. In Russia, the autocratic system placed its ruler in a position of immense authority, but also increasing isolation, as pressures for reform grew without being easily absorbed. These differences did not prevent communication, but they altered its meaning. When Victoria's grandsons wrote to one another, they were no longer simply exchanging family news. They were, in subtle ways, representing their states. Even when they spoke informally, the knowledge of their roles shaped what could be said and what could not. At the same time, the rituals of family continued to assert themselves. Weddings, funerals, jubilees. These occasions still brought the extended network together, reinforcing the sense of shared identity that had been so carefully cultivated over decades. For a moment, in these gatherings, the older vision of a connected royal Europe seemed to reassert itself. The language of kinship, the familiarity of faces, the continuity of tradition, all suggested that the bonds remained strong. But these moments also revealed how much had changed. Conversations that might once have been straightforward now required a degree of caution. Differences in outlook could not always be set aside. Even within the shared spaces of family, the presence of political reality was felt. It did not dominate every interaction, but it lingered, shaping the tone in ways that were often unspoken but clearly understood. Victoria, observing these gatherings, would have been aware of both their strength and their fragility. She could see the continuity, the fact that her descendants still recognized one another as part of a single extended family. But she could also sense the divergence, the growing differences in how they viewed their roles, their responsibilities, and their place in a changing Europe. This awareness did not lead her to abandon her belief in the value of the network. If anything, it seems to have reinforced it. In her later correspondence, there is a continued emphasis on the importance of maintaining relationships, of preserving communication, of remembering shared origins. These were not abstract principles. They were practical efforts to sustain a system that she understood was under pressure. Yet sustaining that system required cooperation from individuals who were increasingly shaped by forces beyond her influence. Her grandchildren were not simply inheritors of her vision. They were participants in a world that demanded adaptation. And in adapting, they sometimes moved in directions that did not align with the assumptions that had guided the creation of the network. One of the most telling aspects of this period is the way in which decisions began to reflect national priorities more clearly than familial considerations. This did not mean that family was ignored, but it did mean that it was weighed differently. A ruler might consider the implications of a decision for his relatives, but he would also consider its impact on his state, his position, and his obligations. This shift can be seen in the way foreign policy began to be conducted. Where once personal relationships might have played a significant role in shaping diplomatic outcomes, they now functioned more as one factor among many. Ministers, advisors, and institutional frameworks played an increasingly prominent role. Decisions were debated, planned, and executed within structures that extended beyond the personal reach of the monarch. For Victoria, whose understanding of influence had been built within a more personal and less institutionalized context, this represented a profound change. She could still offer advice, still express concern, still attempt to guide. But the mechanisms through which decisions were made were no longer as responsive to such interventions as they had once been. And yet, despite these limitations, her presence continued to exert a kind of gravitational pull. She remained a figure to whom her descendants looked, even if only symbolically. Her longevity, her experience, and her central position within the network gave her a unique perspective, one that was respected even when it was not followed. There is a quiet poignancy in this. Victoria had spent much of her life building and maintaining a system of connections that she believed could contribute to stability in Europe. By the end of her reign, that system was still visible, still functioning in certain ways, but no longer capable of fulfilling all the hopes that had been invested in it. The world her grandchildren inhabited was more complex, more structured, and more constrained than the one she had known. It required different kinds of decisions, different forms of leadership, and a different understanding of how influence could be exercised. Family remained part of that understanding, but it was no longer its foundation. As the final years of the 19th century unfolded, this new reality became increasingly difficult to ignore. The alliances that had been forming continued to solidify. The expectations placed upon rulers became more clearly defined. The margin for ambiguity, for balancing between competing identities, began to narrow. And within this narrowing space, the relationships between Victoria's grandsons, once defined by shared ancestry and occasional familiarity, were being reshaped by the roles they now occupied, roles that would soon bring them into closer and more consequential interaction as the political currents of Europe gathered strength and direction. And within this narrowing space, the relationships between Victoria's grandsons, once defined by shared ancestry and occasional familiarity, were being reshaped by the roles they now occupied, roles that would soon bring them into closer and more consequential interaction as the political currents of Europe gathered strength and direction. What begins to emerge, almost quietly at first, is a new kind of distance. Not the obvious distance of geography. Europe's courts had always been separated by borders, but a more subtle distance of interpretation. The same event, observed from London, Berlin, or St. Petersburg, could now carry different meanings, shaped by different priorities. A diplomatic move that seemed cautious in one capital might appear provocative in another. A defensive measure in one context might be read as preparation for something more assertive elsewhere. For Victoria, who had spent decades believing that familiarity could reduce misunderstanding, this development was particularly difficult to reconcile. She had seen, in her earlier years, how a personal relationship might soften the tone of an exchange, how a shared experience might create space for compromise. But now, even when relationships remained cordial, interpretation itself had become less flexible. Each court was operating within a framework that encouraged it to read events through its own strategic lens. This did not mean that personal communication ceased. On the contrary, it often intensified at moments of uncertainty. Letters were exchanged with a sense of urgency, visits were arranged with care, and efforts were made to preserve the appearance of mutual understanding. But the function of these interactions was changing. They were no longer shaping the broader framework within which decisions were made. Instead, they existed alongside that framework, sometimes clarifying, sometimes complicating, but rarely redefining it. There is a revealing pattern in how Victoria responded to these moments. She continued to emphasize the importance of restraint, of careful consideration, of avoiding actions that might escalate tensions unnecessarily. Her advice was consistent with the principles that had guided her own approach to monarchy: measured, deliberate, and attentive to the broader consequences of individual decisions. Yet the environment in which her grandsons operated did not always reward such caution. Political systems were becoming more responsive to internal pressures, public opinion, military planning, economic interests, each of which could push toward firmer, more visible action. A ruler who appeared hesitant risked being perceived as weak. A government that failed to respond decisively to perceived threats might face criticism or instability at home. This created a situation in which the very qualities Victoria valued, patience, moderation, and careful judgment, could be difficult to sustain. Her descendants were not indifferent to these qualities, but they had to balance them against expectations that were often more immediate and more demanding. At the same time, the symbolic dimension of monarchy continued to play an important role. Public appearances, speeches, and ceremonies were carefully observed, not only within each country but across Europe. A gesture made in one court could be interpreted in another, sometimes with unintended consequences. The visibility of monarchy had increased, and with it, the scrutiny applied to royal behavior. Victoria understood this dynamic well within the British context, where she had spent much of her reign shaping the public image of the crown. But extending that understanding across different political cultures was more complex. What resonated in one country did not always translate in another. A display of authority that reinforced stability in one setting might provoke concern in another. The shared language of monarchy masked a diversity of expectations that was becoming more pronounced over time. Meanwhile, the alliances that had been forming continued to solidify, creating a structure that was both stabilizing and constraining. These alliances were intended, in part, to maintain balance, to prevent any single power from dominating the continent. But they also created a network of obligations that could draw states into alignment in ways that were not easily altered. For Victoria, this represented a further shift away from the kind of flexible, relationship-based influence she had once exercised. Alliances were negotiated by governments, formalized through agreements, and supported by military planning. They operated according to a logic that was not easily influenced by personal relationships, however close those relationships might be. And yet, the family network continued to intersect with this system in complex ways. A ruler might find himself bound by alliance to support a position that placed him at odds with a relative. A disagreement between states could carry an additional layer of emotional weight when it involved members of the same family. These intersections did not always determine outcomes, but they shaped how those outcomes were experienced and understood. There is a quiet tension in this overlap between family and state. On the one hand, the network provided a sense of continuity, a reminder that the individuals involved were connected by more than politics. On the other hand, it could not override the structural realities that governed their decisions. The two layers coexisted, sometimes reinforcing each other, sometimes pulling in different directions. Victoria's later years can be seen as a period of adjustment to this duality. She did not abandon her belief in the importance of family connections, but she began to recognize more clearly their limitations. Her correspondence reflects this awareness. There is still a desire to guide, to advise, to maintain cohesion, but it is accompanied by a more cautious tone, an acknowledgement that outcomes might not align with her expectations. This does not diminish her role. If anything, it highlights the complexity of the system she had helped to create. It was never a simple mechanism of control. It was a network of relationships, influenced by personality, circumstance, and historical context. It could facilitate understanding, but it could not guarantee it. It could create connections, but it could not eliminate differences. As the 19th century approached its final years, the balance within this system continued to shift. The weight of political structures grew heavier, while the space for personal intervention became more constrained. The family network remained visible, but its ability to shape events directly was less certain. And within this evolving landscape, the interactions between Victoria's grandsons took on an increasing significance, not because they alone determined the course of events, but because they embodied the intersection of two worlds, the older world of dynastic connection and the emerging world of structured political alignment. It is in these interactions, in the careful exchanges, the measured visits, and the sometimes strained correspondence, that the next stage of the story begins to unfold, as personal relationships are gradually drawn into a context where they will be tested against pressures far greater than those they were originally meant to manage. It is in these interactions, in the careful exchanges, the measured visits, and the sometimes strained correspondence, that the next stage of the story begins to unfold, as personal relationships are gradually drawn into a context where they will be tested against pressures far greater than those they were originally meant to manage. What makes this stage so quietly revealing is that, for a time, nothing appears to break. There is no immediate collapse of relationships, no dramatic severing of family ties. On the surface, the system continues to function. Letters are still exchanged, visits still occur, ceremonies still bring relatives together. If anything, the outward form of dynastic unity remains remarkably intact. But beneath that continuity, the function of those relationships is shifting in ways that are not immediately visible. One of the clearest signs of this shift lies in the increasing importance of timing. In earlier decades, correspondence between Victoria and her children could unfold at a deliberate pace. There was room to reflect, to revise, to persuade over time. By the closing years of the century, decisions often had to be made more quickly, sometimes in response to developments that allowed little opportunity for extended consultation. This acceleration did not eliminate personal communication, but it altered its role. Letters that once might have shaped decisions were now more likely to comment on them after the fact. Advice arrived, but it sometimes arrived too late to influence the outcome. The rhythm of governance had changed, and with it, the rhythm of influence. Victoria, accustomed to a slower, more reflective mode of engagement, found herself adapting as best she could. Her letters remained thoughtful and detailed, but they increasingly existed alongside decisions that had already been set in motion. This created a subtle sense of dislocation. She was still involved, still informed, but not always in a position to guide events as directly as she once had. At the same time, the language used within the family began to reflect a growing awareness of responsibility beyond the personal. Where earlier correspondence might have focused more heavily on character, behavior, and domestic concerns, later exchanges often carried an undercurrent of political awareness. Even when not explicitly stated, there was a recognition that each individual was operating within a framework that extended far beyond the family. This awareness did not erase affection, but it did complicate it. A message of support might be tempered by the knowledge that the recipient was navigating a situation shaped by competing obligations. A suggestion might be offered carefully, with an understanding that it could not override considerations already in place. The tone became more measured, more cautious, more attuned to the limits of what could be asked or expected. For Victoria, this change required a different kind of attentiveness. She had always been perceptive, skilled at reading between the lines of correspondence. Now, that skill became even more important. Meaning was not always expressed directly. It was implied, suggested, or left unsaid. A short letter could carry as much weight as a long one, depending on its tone. A delay in response could signal more than simple busyness. In this environment, influence became less about direct guidance and more about interpretation. Understanding what was happening required careful reading, not only of events, but of how those events were described or avoided in communication. Victoria's long experience allowed her to do this with a degree of sensitivity that few others possessed. But even that sensitivity had its limits, because the forces shaping her grandchildren's decisions were not always visible through correspondence alone. They included pressures that were discussed within ministries, debated within governments, and shaped by factors that lay outside the traditional channels of royal communication. The family network provided insight, but it did not provide a complete picture. This partial visibility is one of the defining characteristics of Victoria's later influence. She could see enough to understand that change was occurring, but not always enough to fully grasp its direction. Her responses were therefore often cautious, grounded in principle, and aimed at maintaining stability rather than pursuing specific outcomes. At the same time, her grandchildren were developing their own habits of communication and decision-making. They were not indifferent to her perspective, but they were also aware that their situations required them to act within contexts that she had not directly experienced. This created a dynamic in which advice was received respectfully, but not always followed. There is no single moment when this dynamic becomes explicit. It reveals itself gradually, in patterns rather than declarations. A suggestion that is acknowledged but not acted upon. A concern that is addressed politely but without change in direction. Over time, these patterns accumulate, creating a sense that the center of decision-making has shifted. And yet, even as this shift takes place, the symbolic role of Victoria continues to exert its influence. Her presence still carries weight, particularly in moments of uncertainty. There are instances where her perspective is sought, where her experience is valued as a source of stability. In these moments, the older system of influence reasserts itself, if only briefly. This interplay between continuity and change gives the period a distinctive texture. It is not a story of abrupt transformation, but of gradual rebalancing. The elements of the earlier system remain in place, but their relative importance is altered. Family continues to matter, but it no longer defines the framework within which decisions are made. As the network evolves in this way, its internal dynamics become more complex. Relationships that were once straightforward acquire additional layers of meaning. A familial connection might now carry implications for alliance, for public perception, or for internal politics. Each interaction is shaped not only by personal feeling, but by an awareness of how it might be interpreted beyond the immediate context. Victoria, attentive to these nuances, continues to emphasize the importance of clarity and consistency. She encourages her descendants to act in ways that reflect stability, to avoid actions that might be misinterpreted, and to maintain a sense of continuity in their public roles. These recommendations are rooted in her own experience, where the careful management of perception had contributed to the endurance of the monarchy. But the environment in which her grandchildren operate is more varied, more fragmented. What works in one context does not always translate to another. The same action can be interpreted differently depending on the audience, the timing, and the surrounding circumstances. Managing these interpretations becomes an increasingly complex task. At the same time, the broader European landscape continues to evolve. Industrial growth, social change, and political movements are reshaping societies in ways that affect how monarchy is perceived and how it must function. These changes do not directly dismantle the dynastic network, but they alter the conditions under which it operates. For Victoria, whose understanding of monarchy had been shaped within a more stable and predictable environment, this transformation presents a challenge. She can recognize the need for adaptation, but the pace and nature of change make it difficult to apply familiar solutions. Her responses remain grounded in principles that have served her well, but those principles are now being tested in new contexts. And within this evolving landscape, the relationships between her grandsons continue to develop, shaped by their experiences, their responsibilities, and the expectations placed upon them. They remain connected by family, but they are also defined by the roles they inhabit. Roles that require them to navigate a world where the balance between personal connection and political necessity is becoming increasingly delicate. It is in this delicate balance that the next phase of the story will unfold, as the accumulated pressures of alliance, expectation, and interpretation begin to converge, drawing these interconnected lives toward decisions that will carry consequences far beyond the family circle. It is in this delicate balance that the next phase of the story will unfold, as the accumulated pressures of alliance, expectation, and interpretation begin to converge, drawing these interconnected lives toward decisions that will carry consequences far beyond the family circle. At first, those pressures do not announce themselves in dramatic ways. They gather slowly, almost imperceptibly, through a series of adjustments, each one rational in isolation, each one shaped by the immediate needs of a particular state. A military reform here justified as necessary for defense. A diplomatic understanding there, framed as a precaution against uncertainty. A shift in tone within a government, reflecting changing priorities at home. None of these developments appear to challenge the fabric of dynastic connection directly, and yet, taken together, they begin to form a pattern. For Victoria, whose instinct had always been to read meaning through continuity, through what remained stable rather than what changed, this pattern could be difficult to interpret fully. She could sense that something was evolving, but its coherence lay not in any single action, but in their accumulation. It was not a matter of one decision altering the balance, but of many small decisions gradually reshaping it. This accumulation is one of the defining features of the period. It does not lend itself to dramatic narrative, But it is precisely through such incremental change that larger transformations take hold. The network of relationships Victoria had helped to build was still present, still functioning, but it was now embedded within a framework that was becoming increasingly structured and less responsive to personal influence. One can see this in the growing importance of preparation. Governments began to think not only about current conditions, but about potential future scenarios. Plans were developed, refined, and sometimes revised in response to shifting perceptions of risk. These plans were not always visible even to those within the family network. They existed within military institutions, within ministries, within circles that operated with a degree of confidentiality that limited their exposure to informal channels. This introduces a new dimension to the story, one that operates partly outside the traditional reach of dynastic connection. A ruler might still correspond with a relative, might still exchange views, but the underlying preparations shaping his decisions could be influenced by considerations that were not fully shared. The result is a subtle form of asymmetry. Communication continues, but the information on which decisions are based is not always evenly distributed. Victoria's awareness of this asymmetry appears in the increasing care with which she frames her advice. There is a recognition that she does not possess complete knowledge, and that her perspective, while informed, is not comprehensive. This does not diminish her authority, but it does alter the way in which that authority is expressed. It becomes more tentative, more reflective, more attuned to the possibility that unseen factors may be at work. At the same time, her grandchildren are navigating environments that demand a different kind of decisiveness. They are expected to act with clarity, to respond to developments with a sense of purpose, and to project confidence in their roles. This expectation is reinforced by the structures around them, by advisors, by institutions, by public opinion. It is not that they disregard Victoria's perspective, but that they must integrate it into a broader set of considerations. This integration is not always smooth. There are moments when advice rooted in familial understanding encounters decisions shaped by strategic necessity. The language used in these exchanges can remain respectful, even affectionate, but the outcomes reveal a shift in priority. The family voice is still heard, but it is no longer the final voice. There is also a generational element to this shift. Victoria's grandchildren have grown up in a world where the boundaries between personal and political are more clearly defined. They are accustomed to operating within systems that require them to separate private feeling from public action. This does not mean that they lack emotional connection, but that they have learned to compartmentalize it in ways that reflect the demands of their roles. For Victoria, whose approach had always emphasized the integration of these spheres, this separation can appear unfamiliar. She had believed that personal relationships could inform public decisions in a meaningful way. Her grandchildren, while not rejecting this idea entirely, are operating within contexts where such integration is more difficult to sustain. As these dynamics continue to evolve, the network itself begins to take on a different character. It is no longer primarily a mechanism for shaping outcomes, but a context within which those outcomes are experienced. It provides a framework for understanding relationships, for interpreting actions, for maintaining a sense of continuity. But it does not determine the direction of events in the same way it once might have. This does not render the network irrelevant. On the contrary, its presence continues to influence how individuals perceive one another, how they communicate, and how they respond to developments. But its influence is more diffuse, more indirect, and more contingent on circumstances. There is a moment, subtle but significant, when this new character becomes more clearly defined. It appears in the way certain decisions are explained or not explained within the family. Where once there might have been an expectation of detailed justification, there is now sometimes a more limited account, a recognition that not all aspects of a decision can be shared. This is not necessarily a sign of mistrust, but of the complexity of the environments in which these decisions are made. Victoria, attentive to these nuances, continues to engage as fully as she can. Her letters remain a central thread in the network, connecting individuals across distance and circumstance. They carry not only information, but a sense of continuity, a reminder of the shared history that underlies the present. But even as she maintains this role, the broader context continues to shift. The alliances that have been forming begin to take on a more defined shape, creating groupings that extend beyond individual relationships. These groupings are not static, but they introduce a level of structure that influences how states interact with one another. Within this structure, the position of each of Victoria's grandsons becomes more clearly delineated. Their relationships with one another are now framed not only by family connection, but by their place within these emerging alignments. This framing does not eliminate the personal dimension, but it does place it within a context that is increasingly difficult to ignore. As the final years of the century unfold, the convergence of these factors, preparation, structure, generational change, and shifting modes of communication, creates a landscape that is both familiar and new. The network remains, but it operates differently. The individuals within it remain connected, but they are also defined by the systems they lead. And it is within this evolving landscape, where continuity and change exist side by side, that the next developments will begin to take on a more visible form, as the underlying pressures that have been building quietly start to express themselves in ways that can no longer be understood solely through the lens of family. And it is within this evolving landscape, where continuity and change exist side by side, that the next developments will begin to take on a more visible form, as the underlying pressures that have been building quietly start to express themselves in ways that can no longer be understood solely through the lens of family. At first, these expressions remain restrained, almost carefully managed. Governments communicate through formal channels, language is chosen with precision, and public statements are often designed to reassure rather than alarm. Yet, behind this measured surface, the calculations guiding those statements are becoming more exacting. Decisions are increasingly framed not just in terms of immediate necessity, but in relation to longer sequences of possible reactions, how one move might be interpreted, what it might prompt, how quickly others might respond. This growing awareness of sequence introduces a new kind of tension into the system. Where once an action might be judged largely on its own merits, it is now evaluated in terms of what it might set in motion. This requires a different kind of thinking, one that is anticipatory, layered, and often cautious in ways that are not immediately visible to those outside the process. For Victoria, whose understanding of influence had been rooted in direct engagement, this shift toward anticipatory calculation presents a challenge. She can sense that decisions are being made with greater complexity, but the logic behind them is not always fully accessible through the channels she knows best. Her letters continue to offer guidance grounded in principle, but the responses they receive are shaped by considerations that extend beyond those principles. At the same time, her grandchildren are becoming more accustomed to this mode of thinking. They are learning to navigate not only the present, but the range of possible futures that might unfold from their actions. This does not make their decisions easier, but it does make them more structured. Each choice is weighed against a set of expectations that includes not only personal and national interests, but the anticipated responses of others. Within this context, the family network begins to serve a different function. It becomes less a tool for shaping decisions and more a framework for understanding their implications. When a decision is made, the existence of family ties influences how it is interpreted, how it is communicated, and how it is received. But it does not necessarily determine the decision itself. This distinction is subtle, but it marks an important transition. Influence has not disappeared, but it has become more indirect. It operates through perception, through tone, through the maintenance of relationships that can ease or complicate interactions. It is no longer the primary driver of outcomes, but it remains a factor in how those outcomes unfold. Victoria, attentive to these nuances, continues to engage with a sense of purpose. She writes with care, choosing her words to convey both concern and confidence. She emphasizes the importance of stability, of measured action, of preserving the conditions that allow for peaceful coexistence. These themes recur in her correspondence, reflecting a consistent belief that restraint and understanding are essential to maintaining balance. Yet, even as she articulates these principles, the environment in which they must operate is becoming more constrained. The structures that have developed alliances, military planning, institutional decision-making, create a framework that is less flexible than the one she had known. Within this framework, the space for informal influence is narrower, and the consequences of miscalculation are potentially greater. There is also a growing awareness, among her grandchildren, of the need to present a unified front within their own states. Public confidence, political stability, and national identity all depend, in part, on the perception that leadership is coherent and decisive. This requirement can limit the extent to which personal relationships are allowed to shape public action. A ruler may value familial connection, but he must also consider how his decisions will be viewed by those he governs. This consideration introduces another layer of complexity. The audience for a decision is no longer confined to a small circle of advisors or relatives. It includes a broader public whose expectations can influence how decisions are framed and justified. Managing this audience requires attention to symbolism, to messaging, and to the broader narrative within which actions are understood. Victoria, who had long been attentive to the importance of public perception, recognizes this dynamic. She had, after all, helped shape the image of the British monarchy in ways that aligned it with stability and respectability. But extending this approach across different political cultures is not straightforward. Each of her grandchildren must adapt to the expectations of their own context, which may differ significantly from the one she knows best. As these adaptations take place, the network of relationships she had built continues to evolve. It does not dissolve, but it becomes more complex in its operation. Connections that once seemed straightforward acquire additional layers of meaning. A visit between relatives might now carry diplomatic significance. A public gesture could be interpreted as a signal of alignment or distance. Even silence, what is not said or done, can take on significance within this environment. This heightened sensitivity to interpretation affects how interactions are conducted. Communication becomes more deliberate, more carefully calibrated. There is an increased awareness of how actions might be perceived, not only by immediate participants, but by a wider audience. This does not eliminate spontaneity, but it does shape the context in which spontaneity can occur. For Victoria, this environment requires a different kind of engagement. She continues to rely on the methods that have served her well: correspondence, observation, careful interpretation, but she also adapts to the changing conditions. Her letters reflect an understanding that clarity and consistency are more important than ever, that ambiguity can lead to misunderstanding, and that maintaining trust within the network is essential even when agreement is not possible. At the same time, the broader European context continues to move toward greater definition. The alliances that have been forming begin to influence not only external relations, but internal planning. Military strategies are developed with specific contingencies in mind, economic considerations are integrated into decision-making, and diplomatic efforts are coordinated with an eye toward maintaining balance within an increasingly structured system. Within this context, the position of each of Victoria's grandchildren becomes more clearly tied to the role their state plays within the larger framework. Their relationships with one another are still informed by family connection, but they are also shaped by the expectations associated with these roles. This dual influence creates a dynamic in which personal and political considerations are constantly being balanced, sometimes harmoniously, sometimes with tension. As the century edges closer to its end, the cumulative effect of these developments becomes more visible. The network remains intact, but it operates within a landscape that is more constrained, more interconnected, and more sensitive to change. The individuals within it continue to communicate, to visit, to maintain the forms of relationship that have defined their connections. But the context in which these relationships exist is no longer the one in which they were created. And it is precisely at this point, when the system is still functioning, when the connections are still visible, but when the underlying conditions have shifted, that the next phase of events begins to gather momentum, drawing these interconnected lives toward decisions that will test not only the strength of their relationships, but the very assumptions upon which those relationships were built. And it is precisely at this point, when the system is still functioning, when the connections are still visible, but when the underlying conditions have shifted, that the next phase of events begins to gather momentum, drawing these interconnected lives toward decisions that will test not only the strength of their relationships, but the very assumptions upon which those relationships were built. What begins to emerge now is not a sudden rupture, but a tightening, a sense that the space for flexibility is narrowing, even if outward appearances remain composed. The structures that have formed alliances, expectations, patterns of response start to interact more directly with one another. Where earlier there had been room to adjust, to delay, or to reinterpret, there is now an increasing pressure to define positions more clearly. This pressure does not come from a single source. It arises from multiple directions at once. Governments seek certainty in their relationships. Military planners look for clarity in commitments. Public opinion, more informed and more engaged than in previous generations, begins to expect coherence and strength from those who lead. Each of these forces operates within its own logic, but together they create an environment in which ambiguity becomes more difficult to sustain. For Victoria, whose instinct had always been to preserve space for understanding, this tightening presents a quiet but persistent challenge. She continues to emphasize moderation, to encourage her descendants to consider the broader implications of their actions, to remind them of the value of restraint. Her perspective remains consistent, shaped by decades of experience in balancing continuity with change. But the responses to her guidance reflect the shifting context. Her grandchildren listen, often respectfully, but they must also respond to demands that are more immediate and, in some cases, more rigid. The calculations they face are not only about maintaining relationships, but about ensuring stability within their own systems. Decisions that might once have been deferred now require resolution. Positions that might once have been softened now require definition. At the same time, the nature of communication continues to evolve. The pace at which information travels accelerates, and with it, the pace at which reactions are expected. A development in one part of Europe is quickly known in another. The time available to interpret, to consult, to respond becomes shorter. This compression of time affects how decisions are made and how they are communicated. Victoria, accustomed to a more measured rhythm, adapts as best she can. Her letters remain thoughtful, carefully composed, but they increasingly operate within a faster-moving environment. The distance between reflection and action narrows, and with it, the opportunity for extended deliberation. This change also affects how misunderstandings arise. In a slower system, there was often time to clarify intent, to correct misinterpretations, to smooth over unintended implications. In a faster system, those opportunities can be limited. An action taken quickly can be interpreted quickly, and that interpretation can shape subsequent responses before clarification has a chance to take hold. Within the family network, this creates a subtle but important shift. The trust that has been built over decades continues to matter, but it is now tested by the speed and complexity of events. Relatives may still assume goodwill, but they must also account for the fact that actions are shaped by pressures that may not be fully visible or easily explained. Victoria's role in this environment becomes increasingly interpretive. She reads between the lines of correspondence, looking for signs of intention, for indications of how events are being understood in different courts. She attempts to anticipate where tensions might arise, to offer guidance that could help mitigate them. But her ability to influence outcomes directly is limited by the structures that now frame decision-making. At the same time, the individuals within the network are becoming more defined in their roles. Their personal characteristics, temperament, style, priorities begin to interact more visibly with the systems they lead. Some are inclined toward caution, others toward assertiveness. Some favor continuity, others are more willing to embrace change. These differences, once contained within a shared family context, now have broader implications. This interplay between personality and structure adds another layer of complexity. A decision is not only the product of institutional logic, but also of individual judgment. And that judgment is shaped by experience, by perception, by the pressures felt within each particular context. The result is a system in which outcomes are influenced by multiple, sometimes overlapping factors. For Victoria, this complexity reinforces the importance of maintaining communication. Even if she cannot shape every decision, she believes that understanding can still play a role in moderating outcomes. Her letters continue to serve as a bridge, connecting individuals across distance, providing a space for reflection within an increasingly fast-moving environment. Yet even as these efforts continue, the broader pattern becomes more pronounced. The network she helped to build is still present, still active, but it is now operating within a framework that is more structured, more constrained, and more sensitive to change. The balance between personal connection and political necessity is shifting, and with it, the nature of influence itself. As the closing years of the century unfold, the convergence of these dynamics begins to take on a more visible form. The alliances that have been forming are no longer abstract arrangements. They begin to influence how states position themselves in relation to one another. Expectations harden, not in a dramatic way, but through repetition, through the consistent alignment of actions with established patterns. Within this environment, the relationships between Victoria's grandsons take on an added significance. They are no longer simply part of a family network. They are also points of connection between systems that are becoming more defined in their interactions. Their communication, their visits, their decisions, all are shaped by this dual role. There are moments when the personal dimension still asserts itself, when familiarity tempers formality, when shared history provides a basis for understanding. But there are also moments when the structural realities take precedence, when decisions must be made in accordance with obligations that extend beyond the family. Victoria, observing these developments, continues to hold to the principles that have guided her throughout her life. She values stability, continuity, and the careful management of relationships. She understands the importance of perception, of maintaining trust, of avoiding unnecessary escalation. These principles remain relevant, but their application becomes more challenging as the environment evolves. And it is within this evolving environment, where the pace of events quickens, where expectations become more defined, and where the interplay between personal and structural forces grows more complex, that the next sequence of developments begins to take shape, drawing the network she built into a context where its resilience will be tested in ways that are only just beginning to become apparent. As these pressures gather and the pace of events begins to quicken, the world Victoria had helped to shape moves steadily toward a threshold she would not fully live to see crossed. When she died in 1901, after more than 6 decades on the throne, the network she had built was at its widest reach. Her children and grandchildren sat across Europe's monarchies. The image of a continent bound together through shared blood, shared memory, and shared ceremony had never appeared more complete. And yet, even at that moment, the deeper transformation we've been tracing was already firmly in place. Because what Victoria left behind was not a system of control, but a system of connection. And that distinction matters. Her influence had never truly rested on commanding Europe's royal houses in any direct sense. It rested on something quieter, on relationships that shaped perception, on familiarity that softened distance, on correspondence that carried not just information, but tone, intention, and feeling. It was a form of influence that worked best in a world where time allowed reflection, where decisions could be shaped gradually, and where personal authority still sat close to political power. But the Europe her descendants inherited was no longer that world. It was faster, more structured, more sensitive to pressure, and increasingly defined by forces that did not move through drawing rooms or letters, but through institutions, alliances, and expectations that could not easily be paused or redirected. In that environment, the great paradox of Victoria's legacy becomes clear. The more successfully she connected Europe's royal families, the more visible those connections became at the very moment they were losing their ability to shape outcomes. Her grandchildren knew one another. They wrote to one another. They met, remembered, and recognized the shared history that linked them. But when decisions came, real decisions shaped by the demands of states rather than families, those connections could no longer carry the weight she had once hoped they might. And so the system did not fail suddenly, continued to function outwardly intact. But it functioned differently. Where it had once helped guide Europe, it now moved within a Europe that was guiding itself through other means. And perhaps the most quietly revealing detail is this: the same letters, the same family ties, the same habits of communication that had once been tools of influence became, in the end, records of something else entirely. Not control, not coordination, but the attempt, earnest, persistent, and deeply human, to preserve understanding in a world that was becoming harder to understand through personal connection alone. If you followed this story all the way through, you might find yourself wondering which part feels most surprising. Not the scale of Victoria's family, but the limits of what that family could actually do. And if you'd like more calm, deeply explored histories like this, stories that look past the surface and into the quiet mechanics of how the past really worked, you're always welcome to stay with the channel, because there are many more histories like this one, where what seems obvious at first turns out to be something far more layered and far more human the longer you sit with it.